Good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word for Tuesday, January the 14th. Hey, join me in Luke 11. Will we ever get out of Luke 11? Well, it may take the rest of this week. Let's see. Grab a good cup of coffee and join me over there. We're going to watch what happens when Jesus has dinner with a Pharisee. Okay, guess who's coming to dinner, folks? It's Jesus Christ. He's been invited. He's going to show up. Will he just be nice and not say anything on some of the key issues of the day, especially the religious hypocrisy of the Pharisees? Nope, Jesus is not likely to be quiet. Let's see what happens. We pick up in verse 37 of Luke chapter 11. And it says, as he was speaking, a Pharisee asked Jesus to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. That was the typical position for having a meal in those days. Was not just to sit up straight, but to recline and relax in someone's home. Wow, I like that idea, don't you? We have recliners often built into our sofas, or we have separate chairs that are called recliners. And how many of you follow the same pattern that Sue and I often follow? Maybe there's something you want to watch on TV while you're eating supper. You don't sit up at the dining room table to eat. Quite often, you go get in the recliner and take it easy to eat. Well, guess what? That's the same thing they were doing in the first century. So Jesus goes in, reclines at the table, and having a meal with the Pharisees, except there's a problem. Jesus doesn't do something that was expected in the day. Verse 38, when the Pharisee saw this, he was amazed that he did not first perform the ritual washing before dinner. Now, what are we talking about when we say the ritual washing? Now, the Pharisees were very stringent on this. This is not in the Mosaic law. There's nothing in the Mosaic law that talks about this, but you were required to wash your hands in some specific ways if you were going to meet the stringent requirements of the Pharisees in those days. Now, for those ceremonial washings, Barclay describes how special stone vessels of water were kept because ordinary water might be ceremonially unclean. Well, in performing the ceremonial washing, one started with at least enough of this water to fill 1.5 eggshells. And then you would begin by pouring the water over your hands, starting at the fingers, running down toward the wrist. Then each palm was cleansed by rubbing the fist of the other hand into it. Water was poured over the hands again, this time from the wrist toward the fingers. And a really strict Jew would do this not only before the meal, but also in between each course throughout the meal. Seriously? That's right. And the rabbis were deadly serious about this, saying that bread eaten with unwashed hands was no better than excrement. A rabbi who once failed to do this was considered excommunicated. Another rabbi was imprisoned by the Romans and used the ration of his own water he was supposed to drink, used it for ceremonial cleansing instead of drinking, nearly dying of thirst. Of course, to the pious Jews of the day, he was a hero. Wow. Well, if these religious leaders were as concerned about cleansing their hearts as they were about their hands, they would be more godly men. We often want to look at some kind of ceremony or ritual to cleanse us instead of the sacrificial work of God on our behalf. So those comments really go with what's about to take place, because when this Pharisee suddenly notices Jesus does not ceremonially wash his hands and is indignant about the fact, it turns Jesus loose on the religious hypocrisy found within the Pharisees. Let's see how far we can get on this today. It says in verse 39, the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and evil. Fools, didn't he who made the outside make the inside too? But give from what is within to the poor, and everything is clean for you. In verse 42, he says, but woe to you Pharisees, you give a tenth of mint, rue, and every kind of herb, and you bypass justice and love for God. These things you should have done without neglecting the others. So Jesus here even goes back to the tradition of tithing. And he says, here's what you do. You do give a tenth. He doesn't condemn tithing. He says these things you should have done, but you should have done something else. You should have paid attention to justice and mercy, giving out of your heart, instead of trying to put on this facade to look religious, especially through these ceremonies you have invented. In verse 43, he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees! You love the front seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you! You are like unmarked graves. The people who walk over them don't know it." Now, this thing about unmarked graves is quite interesting because, of course, the Jews believed you could become unclean and not even know it by walking over an unmarked grave, a place where someone had been buried, and you don't even know there's a body underneath you. Well, you're unclean at that point. My goodness, seriously? Yeah. This kind of language that Jesus is using is so important because it points out just how ridiculous the facade of religiosity was in the life, in the heart of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were so careful in their outward obedience, they would literally tithe from their herb gardens, counting out seeds and leaves and giving a tenth of each to God. And see, legalism of this sort assumes that folks will only know and folks will only follow God if we do these things associated with rules and regulations. Instead, Jesus said that the real mark of a believer is the love they have for others in God's family. Morris puts it this way. He said the Jewish leaders saw it differently. The Mishnah lays it down that it is more important to observe the scribal interpretations than the law itself. Wow. It was if a soldier did great in marching drills and put all their emphasis there but wasn't any good in battle. This would not be a good soldier. But being good at all the outward things of Christianity doesn't necessarily make you a good Christian either. It's amazing how sometimes in seminary we learn how to do church. You learn how to work through a service, how to organize a service, how to go through all the rituals that we go through. Some of those are very meaningful too. The ordinances themselves, how to properly baptize or present the Lord's Supper, and how to do those things that are in your minister's manual. And you can always open that thing up and just read from it if there's any doubt as to how you're supposed to perform. Well, friends, that kind of Christianity by itself and on the outside looks very pious and looks wonderful, but is it accomplishing anything when the heart itself is not with the action? You see, Jesus is pointing to the heart, and I think that's one of the things we have to grasp in this day when we ask, what is our motivation for everything we are doing? Why are you serving? Even if you are serving, you can be serving for the wrong reasons. The Pharisees obviously did things because they liked to be greeted in the marketplace. They loved those greetings. He said they loved the front seats at the synagogues. They wanted to be recognized for their religion. It wasn't because they had some kind of inward desire or compassion for other people that they were really driven to do good. Oh, friends, we need to check our hearts this morning. We need to check our motives and make sure that the one in charge of those is our compassionate Lord himself. Well, that's enough of this today. We'll get into more of these woes tomorrow as Jesus is very, very serious about telling the truth, even though he's at a Pharisee's house for dinner. Well, God bless you. You have a great day in the Lord. I'll see you right here tomorrow when we wake up in his word.